Hey, there's a big controversy going on in this country right now about young people who came here from another country and who may have to exit.
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
The conversation is about deferred action for childhood arrivals. And as with all things Donald Trump, it's going to be very difficult to figure out exactly how he comes down on this. But tonight, the good president from Roger Williams University is going to join us to kind of give a school perspective. Administrations from major learning institutions have stepped up to talk about this and have a point of view, and certainly don't want to see this thing go away, meaning this protection. So President Farish coming up here in just a moment. Let me just give you a couple of headlines. Note, on Friday nights, we record our Friday programs on Thursday, so we don't hit the contemporary issues of the day. So if something major happened, I apologize. We'll catch it on Monday. This is a headline that has been running, which of course causes the reaction, such as this headline, which is that college and university presidents are calling for this program to continue, and Roger Williams University is one of those institutions putting out a press release to that point. Here's some background.
Let's just make a sheet right here.
It took a grassroots effort.
How much again at 3?
Okay, so right after that.
To get thousands of undocumented students like Carla de Jesus a chance at a more permanent life in the United States.
When DACA came through, that's when I started to work. I also acquired a license, and so I learned how to drive.
She came to the U.S. when she was 4, and in 2012, when President Obama granted deferred action, the threat of being deported went away. She could finally go to college, her dream to be a medical interpreter.
I really enjoy helping my community in that way.
Do you think these statements of support will make a difference?
Yes, I do.
David Liebren is the president of Rice University. He's added his name to a growing list of more than 300 college presidents who want deferred action to stay.
Our message to the students is we support them and we're thrilled to have them as part of our community.
It's a message he's hoping will reach all the way to Washington come January when President-elect Trump takes office. But already here at home for students like de Jesus, it's encouragement not to give up on an education she's already started.
I feel very supportive as an undocumented student, knowing that the education system, to an extent, is willing to support and make sure that, you know, we feel safe.
It is such a dilemma.
Right.
It is such a dilemma. It is great to have the Roger Williams president back. President Farish, I appreciate your presence here. Your industry is stepping up to say we need to not break this thing up, correct?
It is. More than 430 presidents have now signed this statement, which is a statement that supports the DACA program and the students in that program. And while we respect the right of an incoming administration to change the ground rules, we worry a lot about the people who are in that program today. It's one thing to say close the borders and let's not have any more people come in who are not properly documented, but for people who came here as babies, who were not part of the decision-making process, but see this America, the United States, as their home, to say now that we're going to go ahead and reverse this program and send them home again, we think would be a huge mistake. So we're basically putting a line in the sand on this and saying, Mr. Trump, we want to let you know that we have a position on this. We're not neutral. This is a situation we think needs to continue.
And those who see this for the first time might say, well, obviously, you're protecting your business interests.
Well, okay, so at Roger Williams, we're talking about 6 students. Now, across the country, there are not 750,000 people in the DACA program, but this is not an issue that from a standpoint of financial bottom lines, is affecting us one little bit. It has a lot to do with a statement of whether or not we're protecting the interests of the people who are part of our community, and we want to stand up.
I'm guessing other institutions have a higher percentage, though, of students.
The numbers, for the
Clearly.
most part, are not large. I don't mean to say there's 750,000 that are in college. There are 750,000 in the program. Some of these people have work permits.
Across the spectrum.
Yes.
You know, and some of you are going to be frustrated by this. You're not going to get a big fight from me on this. I mean, that was my devil's advocate question. Well, you're protecting your industry. The same way I asked the bishop when he has something to say about protecting undocumented immigrants. You know, people will call the radio show and say, well, you know what? It's money in the basket. That's what that's all about.
Sure.
When you talk about that little number of students slash tuition, I get it. The country is a mess on this immigration thing. And what's interesting about the Trump candidacy, and I've had plenty to say about the Trump candidacy, I'm as uncomfortable with it as many people are. Immigration issues polled very low on the totem pole of concern for Americans until he ran. Thought on that?
I think what's happening is that we're being pulled and pushed into tribes, that interest groups that we identify with strongly, and we find instead of a melting pot approach, we're all going to become discrete entities again. So in a sense, the DACA program is the tip of the spear, the tip of the iceberg, if you will, that relates to the notion that there's us and there's them. And the them is going to be characterized in lots of different ways. There are worries in my campus right now, as there are across the country, that students that identify as part of the LGBTQ community, the gay community, if you will, who have seen their rights expanding in recent years, leading up to the Supreme Court decision that allowed same-sex marriage 15 months ago, that they're fearful that all that's going to be rolled back against them because Donald Trump will stack the Supreme Court with conservative justices and they'll come up with a different ruling the next time the question comes up. And so there's the sense that what's happening is now that once you've identified the group that you're going to pick on, that gives license to other people to start making comments. And so I had an anonymous letter that arrived on my desk yesterday from Florida. I'm not going to get into the specifics, but it was a hate letter directed against gays. And it was anonymous, of course, so I have no way of responding to this, but it's not the kind of thing that was happening a year ago or 3 months ago. It's been happening since the election. So part of what the university presidents are trying to say is, look, we are, by definition, very diverse communities on universities, and we don't see ourselves as some of these and some of these and some of these.
And viewers, some viewers listening or watching the show will say, no, your industry, your university settings are just chock full of what you allege to be diverse points of view, but really just lefty types, the liberals who want to tear down everything that is good. And I can't even go through the whole thing because I don't buy it. At the same time, there is the very nature of working with young people, I think, creates an openness to difference, not just diversity, but to difference. I mean, that's part of what education is supposed to be about.
Of course.
There's a part of America, A, that hasn't gone to college,
yes,
and B, that has forgotten what college is about, that I think overreacts to the things that, with all due respect, you people say.
Yes.
Makes sense?
It does make sense, and I agree with you. I think that higher education has become too elitist, too separate from mainstream America. I think we saw that as a consequence of the results of the election.
Yet the alleged dream is to send a kid to college.
Well,
we
sure.
talked before about the expense of it and all that kind of thing.
We did, and there's more to be said on that point. But I want to give you an example. Last night I had an open forum with students. It was a fireside chat. We actually have a fireside. So we had a fireside chat, served cocoa.
Real or fake?
No, it's fake. Okay. Real flame, but yeah, it's gas. Okay. We had the fireside chat. You're distracting me.
Sorry.
I was asking the question to the students. So, what's bothering you? I mean, where are you now? We're no longer talking about the election. Election's done, and what the consequences of the election. What policies are going to emerge that cause you concern? And one of the first students to speak up was a student who has a very conservative viewpoint, and he said, I can't get traction on the campus with my views. People are not listening to me, and I'm really upset about that. I may even think about transferring. And I said to the group, that illustrates a problem we have on this campus that is too reflective of the problem we have in the country. You're all in your own echo chambers. You're listening to your own voices and those people that agree with you. You're not testing your own beliefs with the beliefs of others because you're not open to that. You either watch Fox News or you watch CNN, but you don't do both. We have to, on a university campus, exemplify the kind of conversations that this country needs to have. And so I want you to listen to what this young man has to say, not because you're going to agree with him necessarily, but give him the option of presenting his argument and then come back and do it respectfully.
God bless you. I mean, there's not a lot of university brass that will speak to that out of, I don't know, anxiety about what the customer base wants. But for you to identify that and to speak that way in front of your students, I think is not just admirable, but incredibly important and necessary. I see it just even on the radio program.
Yeah.
You know, listen, the talk radio thing is generally angry and tends to be caller-based, not listener-based necessarily.
Sure.
They're caller-based, very conservative.
Right.
So it's the angry conservative. And so I've had to sit there and get pinged for 6 or 8 months, even burping about Donald Trump. But you know what? There's that going on, but there really is a tunnel vision disposition that people on both sides of whatever issue we're talking about, or the nuanced folks, they're not looking for the nuanced answers to a lot of very difficult questions,
right,
including this DACA question, which I think is incredibly nuanced, isn't it?
Well, it absolutely is, because you're dealing with people who, on the one hand, are not here legally, and therefore the people that say, well, only legal immigrants should be allowed to stay.
And the definition of illegal, when you talk to them about it and talk about civil infraction versus criminal infraction, their head spins because they haven't even looked into the depth of that.
Sure.
I want to talk about that and some of the politics of this when we come back. Fascinating. Stay with us.
You know, we've been very clear about this, that if folks are committing crimes, or if there's a criminal warrant or a detainer, you know, those folks, there's cooperation with ICE, not just in Providence, but across the country. We're talking about folks who are living otherwise law-abiding lives, and what has been encouraging up to this point is that to hear Donald Trump has walked away from his, you know, more concerning and frankly terrifying rhetoric to go sort of house by house and door to door to find folks who don't have documented immigration status. And what we want to do for those individuals, we're not talking about folks who are committing crimes, folks who are living law-abiding lives. At the local level, we're going to stand by you and make sure that you can continue to be a part of our community.
Kind of a long piece there from Mayor Elorza on CNN, where he's almost walking back some of his more vitriolic rhetoric, I think, at his original press conference. Donald Farish is the president of RWU University. And that relates to the conversation about supporting and protecting the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program that has some 750,000 students in it. These are early life arrivals from other places without citizen status, who, by the way, we have spent a goodly amount of taxpayer dollars educating. And we should talk about that. And I want to talk about that in a second. But Mayor Elorza got a lot of criticism from me, because one of the things that I see in politics, and I don't know if you have a perspective on this, in politics, and minority politics specifically, there is, I think, a pretty obvious strategy, and that is to keep people who are worried, more worried, intimidated, more intimidated, discriminated against, because they are the savior. They're the savior. And there's such a nuanced fine line between legitimate angst over the election of Donald Trump and stoking the angst for your own personal political gain. A, do you have an impression about that? And B, where does the university community, yours and others, fit into that conversation?
Let me answer that in reverse order. So what the university is trying to do is to say to our students, Muslim students, international students, students of color, students in the gay community, that we have your back, that we're here to protect your interests as best we can. Now, I think there is a real risk of falling into the trap that you alluded to a moment ago, Dan, which is you get too far out in front of the issue and you create the very issue that you ostensibly are trying to defend against. So I've tried to restrict my concerns to places where Donald Trump or his immediate backers have made declarative statements about intention of what they're going to do if and when elected. Now, of course, it's no longer if, but when elected, when sworn in, as opposed to making stuff up. That, you know, we might have this happen, we might have that happen. We don't have to make up stuff. We can look at things that he has said he's going to do.
But the challenge with him, no matter where you are on any side of the issue, is to try to establish some kind of track record of consistency.
Yes.
You know, he opens up his presidential campaign in one of the worst ways if you're concerned about diversity, yet it stoked a fire across the country for people who are upset about illegal immigration. and the minutia they consider it to be, the rapists and this and that, and all the language, meant little to them. As most of Donald Trump's minutia meant little to them. Finally, somebody was standing up against this horrifying thing of illegal aliens. And even if you didn't feel that way, all of a sudden you say, hey, this must be the issue that I have to really get involved with. He has, as Mayor Lorza rightly pointed out in that CNN discussion, he's backed off.
Yes.
There's no yellow buses coming to pick up a whole bunch of these DACA students and ship them out right now. A, what do you project? And B, what are you worried about specifically about these 750,000 students?
Yeah, I think I want to acknowledge the validity of your point, and this is the good news. I mean, he's demonstrated, Donald Trump, is not inflexible. He's had some talking points during the election. He's walked them back pretty consistently to what we would consider a far more moderate stance. He's no longer talking about deporting 13 million people,
right,
just the criminals. Well, Obama was doing that, so that's not a huge
at
change
a record
in policy.
pace,
Yes,
by the way.
Yes. So the issue is if we can influence his thinking by providing not challenges to him, not sort of in-your-face comments, but saying, we want to reason with you, Mr. Trump, about why it is that we think this is important to continue with respect to DACA, for instance. We think that we can have him have an open mind to that. His danger is that the people that believed his original comment are pushing to have him live up to those comments. And so he's in a bit of a between and betwixt situation right now. And rather than stand at the sidelines to see what he's going to do, we would like to project our position so that hopefully he listens to it.
All right, when we come back, we're going to talk about that, which you just mentioned, and that is, we spend a lot of money on these students. Do you want a return on investment or not? Stay with us. Welcome back in. President Farish has, I think, offered a really good perspective. If you've missed any of this show, check online at foxprovidence.com to catch up on this conversation about universities in general across this country, and Roger Williams part of that project to support the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. This is 750,000 students who are in the spectrum of young through college who are not being shipped out and who we pay for and who are sitting in 5th grade classrooms. I get so much heat on the phone lines when I ask the question, why don't you want a return on your investment for these young people? Here we have an economy which demands diversity. Here we have folks who are here which inevitably, even with the hero on deportation, are not going to be shipped back. Do we want to take a young person who goes through perhaps even 12 years of public education and not provide them the in-state tuition discount that other in-state tuition discounts are offered? So Johnny Smith, who was born here, gets an in-state tuition discount at URI. This doesn't pertain to Roger Williams, but this is a concept. And Juan Sanchez is not going to get it. Juan Sanchez gets discouraged, can't afford it, and ends up, doing different things with his life, perhaps going the wrong way. And we just took at $12,000 a year, taxpayer money, and we booted it, wide right of the field goal.
Yep.
I'm guessing you get my point.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think the tension comes down to the question of, do you reward people who are here without the proper papers by giving them access to education? That's sort of rewarding the wrongdoer in the minds of some people. Or do you say, what's in society's best interest, because they're going to be here anyway, or they have been here anyway? I mean, wouldn't we want to help people become economically independent? They're going to show up to the hospital without medical insurance. They're going to use the social safety net here. We're not going to let them starve in the streets. So why not create opportunities for them to be meaningful contributors to the society where we've already had an upfront investment in the school system? So I think this is a no-brainer to me. You come down on the side of what is in the collective best interest and stop thinking about this as a reward for people who came here under the wrong flag. So
what specifically are you worried about what the Trump administration could do with these 750,000 students?
Well, because they've registered. They're out there. They're on a registry.
ID'd.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, the government knows where you live and where you work, and so they're feeling very vulnerable right now. And I think what that creates is a sense of deep mistrust on the part of those people in the word of the American
But remind me,
government.
what has the president-elect said about this program that I've missed that gives you an acute worry?
He wants to end it. Now, by ending it, does that mean no new people admitted to the program, or does it mean reversing this and sending people in that program back to where they ostensibly came from? And we don't know, because he has not been declarative on that point. And that's one of the reasons why we're saying, well, ending it is one thing, Mr. Trump, but putting those people back on the bus to send them back to wherever their parents came from, we don't think is a wise thing at all.
Well, again, when he says that, it leaves us in a place where not only do you ask that legitimate question, you also have already indicated that you're not going to be sending non-criminal, undocumented people back. And so now you're going to take them off the track towards success, and you're going to dump them into a place where they can go the wrong way and become the criminal that you say we have to deport immediately.
Yeah.
He's going to have to work himself through this, it seems to me.
I think so. And I think it's important for the universities to step up and be accountable to the students that are part of their program.
Well, I think we'll keep an eye on this. Do you have a projection as to where you think this thing is going to go? Do you see a reversal and just forget about it? I mean, with Donald Trump, it's like, oh, I'm sorry, did I say that? I didn't mean it.
Well, if we can discourage him from not starting there, that would be a win. I think, and I don't think he will. I think he will look to the criminal element to deport, because there's no real argument there.
All right. Well, you're overdue for a conversation. We don't have much time here. I have about a minute or so. Roger Williams, to change the subject, is playing a pretty significant role in some of the economic and tourism and branding conversations with Rhode Island. Give me a 60-second commercial on that.
Well, we, of course, have been a strong supporter of Roger Williams the man for a long time, because we named our institution after him. So I'm very pleased to see Roger Williams the man coming into greater prominence in the thinking of Rhode Island. I would like to say we were there first, but that might not be fair. But it's always good to have a chorus of voices sing the same song.
Wait, are you bullish on Rhode Island's branding efforts at this point?
I am bullish on Rhode Island, period. I think our best days are still in front of us.
Is that just the careful answer to a very broad question?
Are you accusing me of being politically correct?
Well, I'm just say, listen,
No, I am bullish on Rhode Island.
Yeah, it's just that Rhode Island needs to get its collective act together to figure out how to market itself, and I think a little bit of lean on the Roger Williams name. The brand itself is not the worst idea in the world.
No, not at all.
And you got a lot of stuff going on in the city of Providence as well. Give me 10 seconds on that, right? You've got some new stuff going on.
All kinds of new things going on. Just watch our space. And let me just say this, Roger Williams the man was the first refugee.
And we'll leave it with that. It's always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you. Final word and we come back. Stay with us. I really have never been able to figure out the kind of anxiety that we have over students who have been here for practically ever, and then we want to chase them out or take their subsidies away or make them compete at a higher economic level for college. It doesn't make any sense. So hopefully Donald Trump will revisit this DACA program for the benefit of overall the economy in this country. That's just my point of view. I agree with the presidents of the universities. Coming up on the Monday program, 38 studios. What? Dan, 38 studios. There's new legislation that we're going to see in January from State Representative Charlene Lima. She's going to put in a bill that demands all the documents be released. We'll talk to her about that on the Monday program. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you on the radio as well from 3 to 6 on WPRL. Bye.